Near the summit of Mount Everest, up in the death zone, on the edge of the north face, there's a cave the climbers call Old Green Boots. Climbing towards the summit, some mountaineers like to stop and pay their respects near to the summit of Mount Everest, who lies preserved in the ice exactly where he perished 10 years ago, with his green boots marking his grave. Nobody ever mentions his name, nor discusses how he died. His body is regarded as a warning. They can expect no mercy in the death zone. On the morning of May 14, 2006, a group of mountaineers were shocked to find another climber, frozen but still alive and sitting next to green boots. Believing there was nothing they could do, they decided to leave the stricken man and carry on. The repercussions of what appeared to be a callous act will remain with them forever. They were condemned by commentators and the media.
New Zealand climber Mark Ingles became the first double amputee.
Questions of morality have been raised after mountaineers
commercial mountaineering made climbing the world's most heartless
Mark Ingles
pursuit.
became a pariah in the climbing world
to save stricken British climber David Sharp on Mount Everest last week.
The first man to summit Everest, Sir Edmund Hillary, judged it the selfish behaviour of a modern generation of climbers.
Their aim is to get to the summit, and the welfare of anybody on the way is just too bad.
It wasn't just anyone that criticised me, you know, it was my childhood hero, you know, well, it was my hero, still is, Sir Ed.
I think Mark Ingles was a bit crazy.
The criticism stung, but what stung even more was that people were voicing opinions on no information of what it was like.
More than 30 people walked past the stricken man that night, and yet a double amputee, Mark Ingles, was the only one blamed for not helping him. What really happened on Everest? Does summit fever turn human beings into heartless machines? Or did Sir Edmund Hillary get it all wrong?
The hardest thing is to think that people think that you would walk past a dying person and not help them if you could.
The 2006 season was shaping up to be one of the best on record. Hundreds of mountaineers, hoping to reach the summit by way of the northeast ridge, were encouraged by forecasts of good weather and perfect conditions. They were anticipating the moment when they would join the ranks of elite mountaineers who had stood on the roof of the world. An assault on Everest begins with acclimatization to the lack of oxygen. The climbers establish a series of camps in stages to the summit. The final push takes them into the death zone, an environment so hostile the body, starved of oxygen, starts to eat itself. The lungs and brain swell, and exposed flesh can instantly freeze.
Why Everest? Well, it's the pinnacle, really. It's the highest. And if you can stand on top of that hill, then the amount of power that it can give you for the rest of your life is just, you know, if you can do that, then, geez, you can do anything.
Mark Ingles was one of a team of 4 New Zealanders who would attempt to match the achievement of Sir Edmund and stand on the summit of Everest. Mark Woodward, or Woody, had already summited Everest twice. On this expedition, he was responsible for leading the team to the summit.
Mountaineering challenges you mentally, it challenges you physically. It's almost getting down to the core of what living is about. You cut away all the extra stuff in life and it's just you and survival, testing your skills against Mother Nature. It's also a spiritual thing too. You know, when you are up high on a mountain like that, you feel like you're up there with the gods.
Mark Ingles' legs were designed and built by Wayne Alexander, or Cowboy, who was also attempting Everest for the first time.
On a personal level, I guess you're looking for a place where you can perhaps find or confront fear. I think any time you take on nature, you're exposing yourself to things beyond your control. That's the beauty of it, you know. It does make you feel a part of something that's hard to get any other way.
Mountaineering is a very, very selfish thing to do, and I wanted Everest to be more than just me climbing it. And so what I wanted to do was to raise money for the Cambodia Trust, a group who I work with in Cambodia, with the landmine, the polio victims, 100,000 amputees or more. What we did was we raised almost $80,000. $80,000 buys an awful lot of legs.
Mark Fetu had been to the summit of Everest 4 times and shared a special bond with Ingles.
We've both sustained frostbite through climbing. Stumpy and Gimpy sort of came from somewhere between Ingles and myself. I can't quite remember where that came from, but yeah, he's Stumpy, I'm Gimpy. Well, I guess Stumpy is because of the fact he's got 2 stumps and I'm the Gimp because I've only lost my toes.
Fetu was working as a cameraman for Russell Bryce, who operates one of the biggest and most expensive expedition companies on Everest.
People come here to Everest and they spend a huge amount of time, money and effort to be here, and they often throw caution to the wind. And it's partly my job to try and keep these people cautious so they don't make false judgments.
There's a lot of debate on how much you pay when you go to Everest. You know, some people pay very little. I think the minimum you can pay is about $8,500 US. And then, you know, Russell's one of the most expensive. You know, it cost me $50,000 US.
One of those who opted not to spend his money with Russell Bryce was Englishman David Sharp. He chose a budget expedition with Asian Trekking, who provided little more than the necessary permit for his 3rd attempt on Everest. Sharp's friend, Jamie McGuinness, had been with him on the mountain before.
David just wanted to book with anybody who would take him. Asian Trekking had a mix of people who wanted to climb independently. He didn't care what he was getting. All he needed was food at base camp, ABC, the yaks up, the gear up, and then the opportunity to climb by himself. Critically, he didn't have a radio.
A lot of people actually like to climb the mountain themselves without any Sherpa support or any technology. And I actually support that. I think it's still great to see. However, things do go wrong, and what happened to David Sharp happens every year, every season on Everest.
Many of the people who climb Everest, you can call them commercial mountaineers in that they climb with groups. David was a real mountaineer.
Sharp had already made an impression with a stylish ascent of the world's 6th highest mountain, Choyu.
He was capable of climbing Everest, no doubt. But once you know that you can do it, you've just actually got to do it. The main issue that we discussed was oxygen. He really hoped to climb Everest without oxygen. Climbing without extra bottled oxygen is extremely dangerous. Everybody knows that. Danger and glory perhaps go hand in hand.
I don't run that style of expedition, and of course I wouldn't have allowed David Sharp to go up by himself. His style of doing the expedition is personal judgment. Maybe he wanted to make a statement in life.
We used to joke that David was a rocket scientist. He really was, but he was getting out of that. He wanted to become a teacher.
By an accident of fate, on the afternoon of May 13, Mark Ingles took a shot of the summit he hoped to reach the next day. Most of the mountaineers who had made their summit bid were descending, but in the distance was a lone climber who was defying all the rules and heading for the summit late in the afternoon. For Mark Fetu, this brought back memories of a fatal mistake.
12 years ago, I was involved personally in similar circumstances, going for the summit very late in the afternoon with a friend, Mike Reinberger. I was filming him, and he was very reluctant to turn around before getting to the summit. And at one point he said, "Oh, look, we'll bivvy on the way down." I was not keen on that idea, but I didn't want to leave him either. So I continued. We summited very late, so we had to bivouac and spend the night out, virtually 70 to 80 metres from the summit. So it was a ridiculously high bivouac. The climb took its toll.
Just keep moving down. Just keep moving down. Yeah.
And on the way down, Mike was struggling to stay upright and walk. He was blind, quite serious stages of cerebral edema where you do become blind. I had to leave Mike. I tried my hardest to help a friend down. Through that I lost all my toes, and I think I'm pretty lucky to be still alive.
From the beginning of mountaineering history, Everest has had a fearful reputation.
Nobody in those days knew what really high altitude meant. Could one even live at such heights? Nobody knew.
Since British schoolmaster George Lee Mallory said in 1924 that he would climb Everest because it's there, and then vanished in the clouds, Everest has claimed more than 200 lives. Mallory's body remains, a frozen memorial, there because it was there. It wasn't until 1953, 29 years after Mallory died on his third expedition to Everest, that New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay reached the summit. Tales of the feat that earned Hillary a knighthood were like fodder for generations of school children like David Sharp. To New Zealand kids like Mark Ingles, Sir Ed was a god, and like him, they desired to attain the highest altar of mountaineers.
I guess every Kiwi kid has a dream, to be an All Black or to follow in the footsteps of Sir Ed. I was never going to be an All Black, you know, I was a scrawny little runt, you know, but, you know, that made for a good climber, you know, it meant that I could follow in the footsteps of Sir Ed.
With his ambition firmly in sight, Mark Ingles became a search and rescue mountaineer on Mount Cook, New Zealand's highest mountain. It was climbing there in 1982 that he nearly lost his life.
You know, it was a decision that Phil Dool and I made to carry on climbing into a storm, and that we thought we'd be able to just sneak down the other side of Mount Cook and get out of the wind. And we happened to strike one of the worst storms in recorded history at Mount Cook. We just stuck into this wee cave near the summit to get out of the wind, and the wind just didn't stop. The wind didn't stop for 13 and a half days.
24 years ago, searchers fought blizzard conditions for 2 weeks to rescue Mark Ingles from Mount Cook. A helicopter crashed. The crew narrowly escaped with their lives.
There's strong winds blowing up through here, but they've got shelter back in behind here.
The men named their ice cave Middle Peak Hotel. It was 2 weeks before they were rescued.
Yep, you know, I've been rescued before. I know what it's like. But I also knew why we sat there for 13 and a half days, because it would have put our rescuers' lives at risk to come up and try and get us at any other time. The result of Middle Peak Hotel was some pretty severe frostbite. The whole 4 foot frozen completely. After a month in hospital, got wheeled into theatre and had both legs amputated, about 140 millimetres under the knee. So many people ask about how do you train for Everest, you know? Well, for me, the best training that I ever had was Middle Peak Hotel.
After weeks of acclimatization, the team are preparing for the assault on the summit. They will leave Camp 4 and spend at least 12 hours in the death zone, battling the blind forces of nature in their attempt to reach the summit and return. The Northeast Ridge route is divided into 3 waypoints: first step, second step, third step, and then the summit. On the route to the first step, they will also pass Green Boots Cave.
The whole of the expedition just leads up to one day, to summit day. You know, when you start to get your gear ready to set off at 11, it's like walking into an exam.
Bloody cold. Yeah.
It's walking into an exam that the consequences of failing, it's too horrible to think.
Everything was feeling good, with one exception that it was so cold. It was a really, really severe morning.
As soon as you're going, it's great. But for me, it's just getting the legs on. It's the toughest time.
Yeah. Our intention was actually to leave at about 1 o'clock in the morning, but we brought that forward by 2 hours. We're away from our Camp 4 at about 20 past 11.
You should be ahead of the other teams on the road, huh?
Yeah, Russell, we're setting off pretty soon.
I had a quick chat with Russell on the radio just to let him know that we were going. In fact, he was saying, come on, you should be going. He wanted us out of there by 11.
How's Mark doing? How's Ingles doing up there?
He's out of here.
Monitoring the expedition's every move, Russell Bryce maintains radio contact from Camp 2, over 1,000 metres below.
He's your extra ears, he's your extra eyes, he's the touchstone, really.
The first of Russell's team to leave that night was Max Chaya, on his quest to become the first person from Lebanon to stand on the summit.
Good luck.
Max was right out in front. He'd taken off, and he had about a 20-minute lead on us.
Okay, cowboy, you ready? Busy.
We got ahead of the pack. We were all pretty much moving together as a group. Our biggest problem was that there was a lot of other people keen to be going for the summit that day as well, and it almost becomes a bit of a rush so that you're not going to get caught up in any traffic jams.
Turned out to be around 35 to 40 people all up, and we were right at the front, which was great.
You're moving in a line all the way to the summit on a fixed rope, and it is a wee bit like a train. It stops and it starts. The carriages all, in a sense, through osmosis, almost pull each other through.
When it's that cold, you need to keep moving to keep warm, to just be able to maintain a reasonable sort of body temperature. It's much, much easier at altitude to get frostbite.
Whenever
You're in class.
Well, good afternoon, everybody.
I stopped, even just for a minute, for seconds, to try and warm.
I'm Professor Dan Breen here at Brandeis University, and I'm very happy to join you this afternoon for today's presentation on Mount Everest, the highest highs and the lowest lows. And before beginning, I'd first like to thank a couple people. First is the author Wade Davis, who wrote a book called Into the Silence, a very gripping account of the first Everest expeditions, from which I've derived a lot of useful facts, some of which I'll be sharing with you today. And I'd also like to thank from One Day University, Blair Eric, who at very unforgivably short notice was able to put together the slide presentation that I'll be sharing with you today. But as we begin our story, let's go back 50 million years ago, when there was a large, vast island in the midst of the Tethys Ocean that at the pace of 6 inches a year was proceeding north in that ocean towards a much larger landmass. The collision was inevitable, and it happened about 50 million years ago. And as a result of that massive collision of the island and the large landmass, the Earth buckled up and vast, majestic mountains were thrust towards the sky. That island became India, and the great thrusting of Earth eventually became the Himalayan mountain range. Himalaya just means dwelling of snow. And among the mountains that was thrust up by that process was this one here, eventually called Chomolungma by the Tibetans, which just means mother goddess of the world. And that mountain, Chomolungma, as a matter of fact, although they didn't know it then, is the tallest mountain in the world. At last glance, the mountain is 29,031.69 feet tall, making it by a fairly substantial margin the tallest in the world. Although maybe we shouldn't be so quick to say that, because if you want to measure height not from sea level, which is what we're doing here, but rather from the center of the Earth, then the honor of tallest mountain in the world actually belongs to Chimborazo, I should say, in Ecuador, because that's 7,000 feet further from the center of the Earth than Chomolungma happens to be. And neither of those mountains are much compared to the tallest mountain in the solar system, and that honor belongs to Olympus Mons, which you can see if you are Martian, stretching 16 miles above the Martian surface. At any rate, nobody knew for many millennia that Chomolungma was the tallest mountain in the world. They wouldn't know that until the 19th century. And the reason was in the early 19th century, I think 1802 to be exact, the British mounted what to this day is one of the most impressive feats of scientific research in human history, the Great Trigonometric Survey of India, an attempt to survey the vast Indian subcontinent, beginning in the south and making their way year by year towards the north. And what they did to begin was they measured out using a chain of known distance, a 4-mile base of distance from the coast south of what is now Chennai, then Madras, 4 miles inland. And once they had the precise distance through that chain measured, they then went from the inland point and they measured off another route of distance to another point to the north of that. And once they had the angle between those lines in the exact precise distance, they were then able to use simple geometry and trigonometry to decide the length of the third line from the third point to the original point on the coast, thus completing the triangle. And they did that all up north and south of India and a little bit east and west for the better part of the rest of the 19th century. Triangle by triangle by triangle. They measured through monsoons. They measured through jungles. They measured through tiger attacks, through bouts of fever, using points of land as high as they could get them for the various points, sometimes hills, sometimes the tops of temples. Sometimes they would have to build towers of their own to get the necessary point. Some of those towers you can see to this day. And the instrument they used, familiar to surveyors, was their version of the modern theodolite. And there's a 19th century theodolite for you there. And eventually, after the triangles and the triangles and the triangles had been laboriously measured out through much of the lowland part of India, they got beyond the northern river valleys and they began to glimpse far above them, many of them inaccessible in Nepal, the great mountain range of the Himalayas. And it occurred to them to use these theodolites to try to get some idea of the height of these majestic mountains. As time went on, by the 1840s, using the theodolite to measure the angle between the tips of those peaks, which they could see through the telescope in the horizontal, they eventually decided perhaps that this mountain here, Kanchenjunga, was probably the tallest mountain in the world, coming in apparently at around 48,000 feet. Not 48, 28,000 feet. And by then, the man who led this survey was this man here, George Everest. And I think, as you can see, he looks a bit like the poet Walt Whitman. And if there happened to be a contest for the two people in history who look the most alike while being the most different in terms of personalities, probably the winner would have to be George Everest and Walt Whitman. George Everest was a famous prickly personality, didn't get along with that many people. He was all business, and maybe that's really all what you would really need to be in order to get this massive trigonometric survey completed. At any rate, while Everest was the head of the survey, some of the theodolite handlers trained their telescopes on a distant peak that was just jutting up so that you could barely see it from where they were, much lower down on the Indian plains. And they began to try to measure the distance, or the angle, in their case, between the peak and the horizontal, and they came up with a bunch of numbers. So based upon the numbers, they're going to try to measure the height. Originally, they called it peak B, then they called it peak 15. They still didn't know what the height was because the numbers crunchers peak that was just jutting up so that you could barely see it from where they were, much lower down on the Indian plains. And they began to try to measure the distance, or the angle, in their case, between the peak and the horizontal, and they came up with a bunch of numbers. So based upon the numbers, they're going to try to measure the height. Originally, they called it peak B, then they called it peak 15. They still didn't know what the height was because the numbers crunchers So Radhanath Sikdar got these numbers about peak B, this peak 15, and after doing all the necessary calculations, by 1852, he had figured out that this peak, whatever it was the tallest in the world. And he figured that it came in a bit taller than Kanchenjunga at 29,000 feet exact. But of course, he didn't want to say, the computers in Sikdar, that the peak was 29,000 feet exact. They figured nobody would believe them. How could it be that precise? So arbitrarily, they tacked on another couple of feet. And so Chomolungma, as they eventually learned, the Tibetans called it, was considered the tallest mountain in the world at 29,002 feet. And that was a great achievement. Now the only question was, what were the British going to call this? And by 1865, they decided to name it after George Everest. That wasn't Everest's idea. He had never seen the peak, but they decided to name it after him anyway. And so for the last 150 years, George Everest would not be pleased to know people have been mispronouncing his name. It's not Mount Everest to most people. Of course, it's Mount Everest. And to this day, even the Sherpas of the high mountain valleys still call it Mount Everest. Well, now the world had a pretty good idea of what the tallest mountain in the world was. And this is the middle of the 19th century. So obviously the thing to do now was climb this thing. And it was lucky that they figured this out in the 19th century, because that was the first great century of mountaineering, when it actually occurred to people that maybe it would be a good idea to climb mountains. Before the middle of the 19th century, hardly anybody climbed a mountain. Why would you? You just have to come back down again. But the 19th century in Europe was the great Romantic era, an era when people were attracted to the sublime, to the majestic, to the grand. And in that kind of intellectual atmosphere, people began to think, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to climb the mountain and experience that natural grandeur for yourself? For example, the Matterhorn, which you see here, had been known for many thousands of years. People have been living in the Val d'Aosta in northern Italy for a long time. They had seen the Matterhorn. They had walked near the Matterhorn. It never occurred to anybody to climb the Matterhorn, however, until the 19th century. Why bother? You can't grow anything up there after all. And so it was that in 1865, the Matterhorn, for the very first time here in the Romantic era, was actually climbed by this man here, Edward Whymper. Many had tried before him, especially in the 1850s, but he was the first one to make the climb. 4 people died during that climb when their rope broke, but Whymper made it to the top and back down and became one of the most famous men in the world for having done so. He would eventually go on to design a special tent for mountaineering called the Whymper tent, named after him, and versions of that tent would eventually be used in the very first Mount Everest expeditions, and they continue to be used to this day. However, nobody was thinking of climbing Mount Everest, at least not yet. And there were several decent reasons for this, as we'll see in a minute. For one thing, nobody quite knew if anybody could survive at that height. This is 29,000 feet. The air, everybody knew, would be very thin up there. And in fact, it's only 1/3 of the oxygen pressure that we enjoy down here on the surface. All sorts of terrible things happen to the human body above 25 or 26,000 feet, including, as people would find out eventually, the very good chance of pulmonary edema. So the physical challenge would have to be worked out. Was it even possible? But there was also a political challenge to work out, because Mount Everest happened to be on the border of Nepal and Tibet. And back then, neither of those countries was allowing foreign visitors, certainly not on a routine basis. And neither of those countries was going to even allow a climbing expedition. And therefore, nothing was going to happen until political relations could be established between at least the British in India, in the Nepalis and the Tibetans. That would finally happen beginning in 1903, courtesy of one man in particular, Francis Younghusband. Now, Francis Younghusband was a colonel in the British Army, and he was the man who was sent at the end of 1903 by the British government to take a small army north of Darjeeling in British India through the Himalayan passes and into Tibet, with the aim of opening political and economic relations with Tibet, ultimately as a way to create Tibet as a useful buffer between British India and the Russian threat to the north, which the British and India were always afraid of. So Younghusband finally took this army through those passes that got into Tibet, and facing them on the way to Lhasa, the great Tibetan capital, was a Tibetan army armed with swords and shields and spears and a few matchlock rifles. The British, on the other hand, had at least 2 Maxim machine guns that could fire 700 rounds a minute, as well as well-trained soldiers with bolt-action rifles. And when the Tibetans wouldn't budge, the result was all too predictable. The British opened fire, and the consequence was that over 600 Tibetans were killed at the cost of only 9 British wounded. That was it. Younghusband himself described this as what it was, a pure massacre, one of the most disgraceful moments in the history of the British Empire. But what it meant was the British entered the capital city of Lhasa in Tibet. And we'll talk about these people in a second. And by doing that, established relations with Tibet that would make possible a climbing expedition maybe in the near future. Ultimately, Younghusband himself became the head of the Royal Geographic Society. And after World War I, it was Younghusband and also the very prestigious Alpine Club of London that put together a committee to sponsor an expedition to Everest. The time was ripe by the early 1920s. The Great War was over. The carnage had shocked the imagination of the world, and the British people needed a reason to feel proud about themselves again after this terrible bloodletting of the 4-year First World War. What better way to elevate British pride than for the British to conquer the tallest peak in the world? They had not been to the South Pole first, they had not been to the North Pole first, but maybe the British could get to Everest first. And so it was that this Everest committee of the Royal Geographic Society and the Alpine Club began putting together the expeditions that would proceed towards Everest. There would be 3 of them. One of them in 1921 would be a reconnaissance expedition. That expedition would try to map out a way to Everest from the Tibetan side. As of yet, nobody knew quite how to get there. And then future expeditions, maybe if all went well, would actually try the summit. The people, the men who were on that expedition were some of the most adventurous, talented, and colorful characters ever to combine for one goal in the annals of human exploration. And I just want to talk about a few of them. Wade Davis does a good job talking about all of them. But one man, you've been looking at this for a while now, is the man standing up second from the left. And that's Colonel Charles Howard Bury, aristocrat, Anglo-Irish aristocrat with the big estate in Ireland, who spoke 27 different languages and had extensive experience hiking and to some extent climbing Himalayan peaks before 1921. Howard Bury is known for a lot of different things, but on one of his trips to India, he happened to come across a bear, which he named Agu, and he adopted the bear, took it back to Ireland, and really enjoyed in his spare moments wrestling with this bear. And I'm very pleased to say that Agu, the bear, actually liked Ireland and lived 20 happy years on Howard Bury's estate. Howard Bury, like many of these men, had fought in the Great War. He fought in many of the major campaigns of the Great War, was captured by the Germans in 1918, escaped, was captured again, somehow survived, and he was one of those who would be a leading influence on the first expedition, the reconnaissance expedition to Everest. Unfortunately, one of the things Howard Bury did on that first expedition was he found a footprint at about 21,000 feet, and he talked about that footprint to the press, and that's the origin of the legend, which still persists today, of an abominable snowman, so-called, somehow walking about in the high passes and lower slopes of the Himalayas. But he wasn't the only one worthy of note. Many others were as well. This is the man who led the second expedition to Everest in 1922. That's Charles Granville Bruce, also an officer in the British Army. Charles Granville Bruce has many distinctions. He was the one in the latter part of the 19th century who actually introduced the idea of wearing shorts to the British Army. Those soldiers have been resisting this for many years, senseless to resist shorts in the kind of climate the Army was fighting in, and Bruce finally got them to adopt the idea of wearing shorts. He was an officer in the Gurkha Corps, and he spoke fluent Nepali because of that, was very proud of that. And it was at the head of the Gurkhas in 1915 at Gallipoli that Bruce was gravely injured by Turkish machine gun fire that took away most of its knees. And his doctor told Bruce, you can recover from this, but you should avoid uphill climbing. Don't be climbing uphill. And yet he overcame the pain, and he would actually be chosen to lead, as I said, the 1922 expedition to Everest. And there was also a third figure worthy of note before we go on, and that's this man here. That's the remarkable George Ingles Finch, an Australian who at the age of 13 conceived of the ambition maybe to someday climb the highest mountain in the world. He decided he wanted to do that because he had just finished chasing a bunch of wallabies up Mount Canobles in Australia. And once he'd done that, he decided that the only logical next step maybe is Mount Everest. Finch was a remarkable character in many ways, but one reason he's worthy of note is that he was the one more than anyone who was an apostle of oxygen. It was his determination that Everest would never be reached, the summit was never going to be attained unless oxygen canisters were taken along. And grudgingly, in 1922, the Everest Committee allowed Finch to take these apparatuses, these oxygen canisters, with him on the second expedition. Finch was lucky to go on that expedition. He wasn't allowed to go in 1921 on the reconnaissance because there were a couple strikes against him. First, he was an Australian, and that made him automatically suspicious to the fuddy-duddies on the Everest Committee. And second, he had a rather checkered personal history. He was actually twice divorced. And if you put that together, that's probably why he wasn't allowed to go originally. But he finally was allowed to go in 1922. And as we're about to see, he played a major role in that expedition. But the man everybody remembers about these early Everest expeditions, above all, was this man here, university graduate George Lee Mallory. the famously good-looking part of the Bloomsbury group, who, even by the time he was in his early 20s, had a lifetime worth of climbing experience. Impossibly good-looking, and also unbelievably agile on the rocks. He was a natural climber, and after dozens of expeditions to the Alps, had as much a climbing experience, at least below 15,000 feet, as anybody in the world. Mallory was a brilliant climber in many respects, but he had a couple faults, or a couple things that are hard to explain about George Lee Mallory, who went on all three of the early Everest expeditions. For one thing, he was famously absent-minded. He would lose things and forget things. And in 1921, it was one of his responsibilities to take photographs from various vantage points up high, approaching the approaches to Everest. And he took all these wonderful, brilliant photographs, gorgeous scenery, only to find out later on that he had put in the glass plates backwards so that none of those famous photographs actually existed. Of course, you can't take any photographs if the plates are in backwards. It was all his fault. The other thing that's hard to explain about him is he hated all Canadians, as Wade Davis points out. And he may be the only person in history ever to hate all Canadians. And we're not sure everybody is really able to explain why Mallory felt that way. But he would go on the expedition and, as I said earlier, proved to be the most famous member of all. Well, they set out in 1921, like Younghusband's army had done, from Darjeeling in northern India, British India. They went up through the high passes and eventually down into the Tibetan plateau, where they were going to now turn left and go west towards a place where they could then turn south towards the Himalayas and Everest. And along the way, they came across many scenes that no European had ever seen before. Tibetan monasteries and dwellings, many of them, as you can see here, made of stone. They came across valleys filled with groves of juniper trees. They saw wildflowers in varieties that were astonishing, many of which had never been seen by Europeans. They saw at least 100 varieties of butterflies and moths in gorgeous natural vistas as they approached the Everest region. And as they made their way through Tibet, and here's a view of Everest from one part of the Tibetan plateau, they kept seeing these chortens, which you see before you on the screen. And those are Tibetan Buddhist shrines. There are 8 different kinds of chortens, each one of them representing a different stage in the life of the Buddha. And they were all over the Tibetan landscape, up into the high hills. Today, many of them are gone because of what the Chinese did to them during the Cultural Revolution. But at the time, they were all over the place, and nobody could be failed to be impressed by them. Ultimately, though, the point was to find a good route to Everest and maybe a good prospective route to the summit. And that eventually is something they accomplished. They eventually got to, by May of 1921, the East Rongput Glacier. And that led to the area here on the lower right to the map. That was called the North Col by the expedition, COL. It's a field of ice and snow. It's not easy to climb. But once you get to that North Col, which you see on the right, then you turn to the left and you go up that ridge leading at the left-hand side of your slide towards the lower part of the summit. Now, once you get up that northern ridge, then you can see right, you take a right, as you can see, that's the Northeast Ridge. And the Northeast Ridge, they thought, would take them ultimately to the summit. So they found the route in 1921, but they were in no condition, of course, by then to attempt to climb. That would have to come till later. It was now May and June of 1921. And the rule of thumb is on Everest, you don't try to get to the summit before that because it's the winter. And you don't want to go after June because that's the monsoon. Really, you don't want to go after early June if you can avoid it. Because once the monsoon starts, that means the winds get to be much heavier. That means the ice melts a little bit in the sun. And it also means, because of the melting ice and the blowing snow, that that's a bad time for avalanches. So they turned back in June of 1922, leaving the attempt at the summit for a later group. Along the way, they got to know Tibetans as well, not very well, but as well as Europeans did at the time. They were very impressed by some elements of Tibetan hardiness and endurance, some parts of their culture. A couple of things they were never able to get used to. That, by the way, is Mallory in the middle. One thing they never got used to was the fact that Tibetans, at least back then, typically only bathed once a year, usually in September. And the other thing that they couldn't get used to was the famous hot Tibetan yak butter tea, which to European palate did not taste good at all, but which serves as a real restorative for Tibetans in the high passes, who in the plateau, who in the bitter cold have got to herd yaks. So for Tibetans, it made sense. Europeans could not quite get used to it, at least not for a long time. Now it was time, ultimately, for the expedition of 1922. Now, Finch would go along on that expedition, bringing with him oxygen canisters much like this. It didn't weigh very much, but if you had a few of them on your back, that could be about 30 pounds, not easy at the great height that they were now going to try to attain. During that 1922 expedition, they didn't get to the summit, but George Finch got pretty close. He got above 27,000 feet, setting a new height record, and he could see on the northeast ridge before him the route to the summit. And he might have been able to make it because he did have oxygen, still May of 1922, but he decided to turn back because his climbing partner, Charles Bruce's cousin, Jeffrey Bruce, was signaling to him that he couldn't go on. Something had gone wrong with Jeffrey Bruce's oxygen canisters, and that meant his life was in danger. And so rather than achieve the glory of the first summit, which he might have done, George Finch turned back to save the life of Jeffrey Bruce. And that's why the summit was not attained in 1922. The end of the story of 1922, though, is tragic because Mallory decided maybe it was time to make one more attempt after Finch's attempt failed. By now, it's June 7th, 1922. We're into the beginnings of the monsoon, but Mallory decided he wanted to try anyway. So he took a party accompanied by many Sherpa porters. Charles Bruce, as much as anybody, had understood the need to have Sherpa porters and guides if you were ever going to attain the summit. Mallory knew that too, as did everybody by then. So Sherpas accompanied this party up the North Col on June 7th, 1922. And as they were just beginning to end the climb up the col, all of a sudden the snow gave way. There was a tremendous sound. An avalanche had happened. Tumbling down the peak, all of them went. Mallory was lucky to survive, but 7 Sherpas did not survive. They died in that avalanche. The first of what we know to be 309 people to die in the process of trying to climb or come back down from the summit of Mount Everest. 7 Sherpas dead. Charles Bruce, the leader of that expedition, was able to get 13 pounds paid to the families of all the Sherpas who had died, which doesn't sound like much, but it's worthy to point out that in 2014, after 16 Sherpas died on Everest in a terrible avalanche, the Nepali government promised to pay to those families $415 apiece, which in real terms is less than the 13 pounds that Charles Bruce provided for the families of the Sherpas who died in 1922. And by the way, while we're on the topic, the very worst death toll in Nepal on Mount Everest happened on April 25th, 2015. And that was the day of the Great Everest earthquake. And on that day, a little bit, I think 16 people died on Everest. And I think actually the death toll in 2014 was a little less, but 16 died on Everest in 2015. It is also worth pointing out, while we're on the topic, that although I'll use the word Sherpa in the presentation, the fact is that many of the Nepali guides who to this day are instrumental in Everest expeditions are not technically members of the Sherpa people. Most of them are, but many of them are Guruns and Kshetris and other Nepali groups, but they're all often considered or thought of under the overall name Sherpas. Well, the 1922 expedition hadn't quite made it to the summit, but the Everest Committee was not done yet. There was going to be another expedition, an expedition in 1924 that Mallory was going to go on again, that he well knew was probably going to be the last time he was going to try to make the summit. He was getting a little older by this time. He was 37. By this time, the attempts to try to make the summit of Everest had begun to capture the imagination of the world. And as a result, Mallory and others went on speaking expeditions around Britain and other countries to meet a very anxious public, maybe raise money for the 1924 expedition. And that's why in 1923, Mallory found himself in New York City, giving speeches to interested people who would come to see him. And it was during one of those speeches that a reporter happened to shout out to him, why bother climbing Everest? not a bad question. And it was to that question that Mallory gave the most famous response in the history of mountaineering, because it is there. Was that some kind of existential insight on Mallory's part? Was this some well thought out explanation? Probably not. Many of those who know him think that probably he was just in a hurry, he was impatient, he wanted to get to a speakeasy on Manhattan, so he just blurted out because it was there and left it at that. But nobody, of course, will ever forget that statement. But the stage was set finally for the 1924 expedition. Mallory, as I said, would be a member of that. Others who had been on earlier expeditions would go too, but there were also some new members of the expedition in 1924. Among them, the man to the left standing up, and that's Sandy Irvin. Sandy Irvin was the only man in the expedition not to have fought in World War I, or to have been alive in some capacity to participate in the war. He was too young in 1914, although when he was 15 years old, he was enough of an engineering genius to design a way to fire a machine gun precisely through moving propeller blades of an airplane. That's the kind of remarkable person he was. All of these men were remarkable in their own way. So Irvin was going to go, a very, very strong man with some mountaineering experience. And there in the slide, you see Mallory again. He's the man standing up just on the other side of Irvin, as they're facing the screen, just to Irvin's left. I should point out that Finch was not on the 1924 expedition. And the reason was that he had delivered some unauthorized lectures, not with the Everest Committee's permission. They got angry at him about that. And so he wasn't allowed to go. Notice how all of these men are dressed. They seem to be in Norfolk tweeds with wool and layers of cotton. Not a very sensible way maybe to go about it. Finch had actually invented a kind of coat with eiderdown in balloon fabric on the outside, the ancestor of all those puffy eiderdown jackets that people wear around the world today, which kept them nice and toasty and warm. But the others felt there was something stupid about that kind of coat. So it was in tweed and wool that this expedition would try to attain the summit of Mount Everest. And try they did. The story goes like this. They eventually got to a point where maybe they could attain the summit through a series of camps, so that at a camp called Camp 6, at just below 27,000 feet, I think, it would be Mallory and Irvin, who you see here, who would actually attempt the summit. That's Irvin on the left, Mallory on the right. And in the screen, you can see them beginning to fiddle with their oxygen tanks for the trip, the hazardous trip up the northeast ridge towards the summit. The story goes something like this. They're right at Camp 6, and they began to make their way up. Approaching Camp 6 was the geologist John Odell on that day. The day was June 8th, 1924. And Odell couldn't see much above him, although he knew that Mallory and Irvin were probably on their way. And then all of a sudden, there was a break in the clouds. And Odell later said that he could see in that break of the clouds 2 moving dots proceeding up the northeast ridge. And if you look at the map, Odell thought they might have been approaching a ridge known as the second step, which you see there. He marveled at the sight in the beautiful sunlight, what he conceived to be Mallory and Irvin slowly approaching the summit, maybe less than 1,000 feet away by the time they would get to the second step. Here's another view of what that might have looked like in real terms. But before Odell could see what was going to happen next, a snow squall happened, the vision was obscured, and by the time the sun again lifted and he could actually see in front of him, there was a lot of fresh snow on the ground and he could no longer see Mallory and Irvin. Odell made his way to Camp 6 to see if he could wait for Mallory and Irvin. The reason he thought they were probably going to have to come down by daylight, as it turned out, because Mallory, in a typical act of absent-mindedness, had misplaced his flashlight. So if they were going to get to the top, they probably couldn't be there after dark. They would have to be back at Camp 6, hopefully by daylight or just after dark. But Odell could not wait there forever because there was only room in the whipper tent for 2 people, not for a third person. Odell waited as long as he could. He made his way a little bit beyond Camp 6, yelled out for Mallory and Irvin. Nobody responded. And so Odell had to go back down. Mallory and Irvin were never seen again. Odell went back to Camp 6 later on the next day. There was no sign of them. The people back down in the lower base camps, Camp 5 and so on, anxiously awaited any news from them. No news arrived. And ultimately, all Odell could do was stretch out a couple sleeping bags in the snow, making a T to signal to those on the North Pole below that, in fact, there was, quote, no trace, unquote, of Mallory and Irvin. They had indeed disappeared. And to this day, nobody knows what happened. Did they make the summit or not? They could have. There were those who believed that Mallory would never have turned back if he had gotten as far as the second step, so close to the summit as that was. Others believe that they would have had to turn back as darkness set in. Maybe there was an accident on the way to the second step. Maybe they never got beyond the second step. We'll never know. Mallory's body was only found by the climber Conrad Anker in 1999. And if you look at this slide, it was found at a point just below the second step, to the left as you're looking at the slide, a little bit below on that ridge that you can see directly in front of you at the center. That's about where Mallory's body was found. And when they found the body, they couldn't find the picture of Mallory's wife, Ruth, which leads some people to think that Mallory did make the summit, left the picture of Ruth at the summit, and then died on the way back down through some accident. And they clearly had an accident. Mallory's foot was broken. He had a bad puncture in his forehead. There was some fall. But did he get to the summit or not? We don't know. Many believe he could never have gotten beyond the second step. The second step is about 100 foot high. Some of it's vertical. Would have been a really, really big obstacle. But at any rate, the mystery endures. And after 1924, for several years after this unsuccessful attempt to make it to Everest, the British stopped trying. They tried again beginning of the 1930s, however. And as we begin to conclude the presentation, I did want to point out that a couple really major things, important things, happened in those unsuccessful 1930s expeditions. But one thing was that a climber, a Sherpa named Tenzing Norgay, went on those expeditions, several of them, and began to get really valuable climbing experience that would serve him very well a little bit later on. But another thing I should point out, and maybe you've been wondering about this, why doesn't anybody just fly over Everest? Why are you bothering with these long, arduous climbs? Why not do it the easy way, supposedly? Why not fly over Everest? And in fact, in 1918, some people proposed that the British do just that, fly over Everest and then drop somebody via parachute, maybe, on top of the peak. Well, I'm kind of glad that nobody actually did that in 1918. But in 1933, a similar attempt would actually be made. That's a lecture in itself. I'll just give you the broad details. A man named Lord Clydesdale, an adventurer named Lord Clydesdale, Douglas Hamilton was his name, decided he wanted to fly over Everest, but he needed the money to fund the expedition. So he went to a woman named Lady Houston, Lucy Lady Houston, who happened to be, according to some accounts, the second richest woman in Great Britain. She apparently had gotten most of her money because she'd been the mistress of the man who owned the Bass Ale Brewery. He left a lot of his money to her. That's where she got her fortune. And one day, Lord Clydesdale delighted her by showing up at her Scottish estate in kilts, and Lady Houston decided to fund this attempt to fly over Everest. She actually believed that if the British could just fly over Everest, that would capture the imagination of the people of India, and they would stop these silly ideas of theirs that they should be an independent country, if only the British could fly over Mount Everest. And the idea that Lady Houston would believe that maybe tells you all you need to know about how well the upper crust of Britain really understood the people of India. At any rate, the expedition did happen, and Lord Clydesdale and his partner, Lieutenant McIntyre, got in the cockpits of this plane here, a plane like this, the Westland Wallace 6. Notice this is an open cockpit. And in the freezing cold of the stratosphere around Everest, they approached the peak wearing a bunch of layers of wool in 1933. And they did, in fact, fly over Everest, the first people to do so. Lady Houston would eventually go on to provide the money that would fund the research and development for the plane that would eventually become the Spitfire, although Lady Houston would die in 1936 before knowing the role she had played in winning the Battle of Britain. There's a lot of unsavory stuff about her we could go into, but luckily for you probably, there's just not enough time. And so to conclude, let's finally get to the successful element of the story, which began to happen after 1950. nobody up to then had gotten to Everest by the Tibetan side. Everest would not be climbed from the Tibetan side until the Chinese did it in 1960. But what happened in 1950 is there was a rebellion in Nepal. A new government took place that was more willing to open things up a little bit to the rest of the world. And as a result, they allowed expeditions to Everest from the Nepali side, the southern side. And thus, in 1951, a British expedition led by the great mountaineer Eric Shipton did get to a point where they could chart a route up to Everest from the southern side. As you can see here, going up what's called the Khumbu Icefall and establishing, one would think, a series of camps from which eventually the summit might be attained. Shipton and his crew couldn't do that in 1951, but they pointed the way for 1952, a Swiss group, to actually come very close to the summit indeed. And that group took with them, not as a porter, but as a full-fledged member of the expedition in his own right, Tenzing Norgay. They got to well over 27,000 feet. Tenzing Norgay and his Swiss comrades spent the night in tents, battered tents, with no sleeping bag on the last day of the attempt to get to the summit, with no water except what they could melt through candlelight in nearby snow. They got close, but they weren't able to get the whole way. They had to come back down. But that was 1951, and luckily, there was going to be another chance in 1952 for the British. Nepal was only granting permits for one expedition per year. The British had gone to 51 under Shipton, the Swiss in 52. The British would have their chance, another chance in 53. And it was that expedition that finally achieved success when, as we know, Tenzing Norgay on the right and Edmund Hillary on the left finally did achieve the summit. It was May 29th, 1952. They left their camp, which they called Camp 6, at 6:30 in the morning, made their way up the ridge towards the summit. There was one major obstacle, about 40-foot cliff, to this day called Hillary Step. But they got beyond that, kept climbing for another hour, and then got to the top of the world. They had a flag with them. They took a few pictures. They spent 15 minutes there. Hillary left a cross. Tenzing Norgay left some chocolate. Tenzing Norgay never revealed who literally was the first person to actually step on the summit. Hillary, I should say, he never revealed it. Tenzing Norgay said that Hillary was the first, but Hillary never confirmed that. All we know is that they came down after 15 minutes to some welcoming members of the expedition with nice hot soup for them. And nobody knew they had done it for another couple of days. The word only spread on June 1st, 1952, timed to coincide with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth on June 1st, 1952. What a day that was for the fading British Empire. What a day of pride. The Daily Express, one of the newspapers of London, had a picture of the glowing new queen on the cover, along with the headline, "All This and Everest Too." I should say that the only reporter on that momentous 1952 expedition was a man named James Morris, who would go on to be the most respected travel writer of the 20th century. James Morris wrote an account of the Everest expedition. That was 52. In 1964, James Morris began being one of the most and first high-profile people ever to begin the process of gender reassignment. And by 1972, he had gender reassignment surgery, transitioning from James Morris to the female Jan Morris. Jan Morris would eventually die in 2020, just a couple years ago. Now to conclude, ever since that 1952 expedition, 4,000 people have climbed Mount Everest, almost all of them from the Nepali side, that is the southern side, using many of the same camp locations that Tenzing and Hillary had used in 1952. The result of all those people on Everest, of course, has been not just environmental degradation. As you can see here, it's also been dangerous overcrowding. To climb Mount Everest as part of a touring group to this day, you need something like at least $50,000, I think, up to well over $100,000. And that price brings you Sherpa guides and assistance. It brings you oxygen, it brings you food, it brings you everything you need. And that way you can join others on the road to the summit if you get a climbing permit. Not always are people certified to climb really in good health to do so, but often they do so anyway. And many of them do it because they want to put that on, they want to check that off their bucket list. Seems like a good thing to do. But there are others who seem to do it for reasons like this. They have an Instagram account. They just want pictures of Everest on their Instagram account. The kind of attitude that Mallory and Tenzing and Finch and Hillary would have had a very difficult time understanding. But on they go. And the reason is, especially beginning of the 1990s, the government of Nepal, and to a lesser extent, the government of China, has figured out that these climbers bring a great deal in climbing fees to the economy, millions of dollars worth, ultimately from the touring companies, and also a lot of money that they spend once they're here. But the result of that is a lot of trash. 2019, 23,000 pounds of trash had to be removed from the area around the Khumbu ice field and base camp. And also, as I said, this overcrowding can be pretty dangerous. Weather conditions change very quickly on Everest, even before the monsoon set in. And what's going to happen during climbing season, if you got a lot of people on the approaching the summit, as you can see here, and because of conditions, you got to turn around really quickly. Well, of course, the danger can be that people die under circumstances like that, as they did in 1996, when 8 climbers died in the episode documented by John Krakauer in his famous book, Into Thin Air. And others died that way too, almost every year. But the money is there, and so the permits continue to be granted. The climbing season was canceled during the worst of the pandemic, but I believe it's on again. Well, before this era of modern Everest tourism, we should remember, as we've just been talking about, the identities and the stories of the truly adventurous people who were doing this on their own as part of very small expeditions. But that story continues even into the late 20th century. So as we conclude, I did want to point out a couple other famous pioneers on Everest, and that is Junko Tabai, as you see on the screen, all 4'9" of her. And she's the woman in 1975 who helped lead the first all-female expedition to climb Everest. She was able to surmount Everest, the first woman to do so, even though she had been buried a little bit earlier in an avalanche in which she lost consciousness for at least 6 minutes. She summoned her courage anyway, and she got to the top. But maybe the greatest mountaineer of all, maybe the greatest Everest feat of all, would actually happen in 1980, courtesy of this man. That's Reinhold Messner. Reinhold Messner was the first person ever to climb solo on Everest without oxygen, solo without oxygen at 29,000 feet. And he did that at about the beginning of the monsoon season when it was getting to be dangerous. And he also did it by taking a slightly new route that some had cited before that nobody had ever taken on the Northeast Ridge. And that 1980 feat may very well be the single greatest mountaineering feat on Mount Everest. And it's one of the reasons why Reinhold Messner, who is still with us, is sometimes considered the greatest mountaineer in history. But he's a purist, and he doesn't cotton with people who join these big Everest tourism companies and go to the top that way. He doesn't see much use in that. Why not go to Disney World if you're going to be doing that? And he's enough of a purist to believe that at least surviving in him and a few others is the individual spirit, the questing spirit of Mallory and the others who climbed Mount Everest, not because they wanted likes on their Instagram account, but because they wanted to demonstrate through their own achievements a certain testament to the human spirit and what people at their best are capable of. And I'm going to leave the last words as we look at Reinhold Messner to Eric Shipton, the mountaineer who had helped pioneer the route, the Nepali route, up the southern route to Everest. And it was Shipton who said, contrary to the modern spirit of Himalayan tourism, that no exhibition should ever be launched unless you can plan it on the back of a cocktail napkin. And I'll leave you with that, and I look forward to hearing and maybe trying to respond to your questions. Thank you very much. Okay, hello again, everybody. I just wanted to begin our question and answer session now by clarifying a mistake I made earlier. I think I had said that I wasn't sure about the number of deaths during the 2015 earthquake, the Great Nepal earthquake. And I checked into that, and the number of deaths is 22. So most of them were Sherpas, but not all of them were. The great death toll among Sherpas, 16 died, was 2014, the year before. And we have a number of questions that have come in that I thought I would take a look at. First of all, one question about the members of the expeditions in the early 1920s. The Everest Committee was sure that all of the members of those expeditions had to be members of the British Empire and preferably British themselves. So one reason they objected to Finch was that he was Australian and not technically British. So every single member was British. They weren't Irish, but Charles Howard Bury was English. He just happened to have an estate in Ireland. So they would have been at most Anglo-Irish, but they were all technically of British ancestry. And that wouldn't be true so much in the 1930s, but it was certainly true in the 1920s. Now, what local Tibetans thought of this climbing probably was all sorts of things, but according to the climbers themselves, the dominant sentiment was it didn't make much sense to go up into those mountains, especially way high up where the summits were. But their idea was that as long as they were getting paid, which they were, then it might not be such a bad job to have for at least a short time. Many of them took very grave risks on behalf of the climbers, and the climbers, to a man, spoke glowingly of the way the Tibetans behaved and the Sherpas behaved as porters and guides to Everest, and especially on the slopes. There was some sentiment among some Tibetans that there in the upper reaches of the Himalayan slopes, demons lurked, and in order to appease them, there would often be prayer ceremonies before proceeding further into the Himalayas. And to this day, there's always a prayer ceremony before a company-guided tourist group will go up on the slopes of Everest. So that tradition has persisted. As far as the type of clothing and gear, the type of gear they used was pretty primitive. You know, some ropes, but nothing of what you see in a normal or modern expedition. But they certainly had goggles. Maybe the most important kind of gear that they had that prevented disaster was goggles, which prevented snow blindness. If you didn't have your goggles, you weren't going to get very far under those conditions in Everest. But as far as clothing, it was Norfolk tweed in layers of cotton and wool, heavy trousers, heavy socks, boots, not necessarily what we'd call climbing boots, but boots that were as well equipped as they could find for conditions like this. But it didn't really get more technically advanced than that, not until much later, especially in the 1950s. I didn't mention too much about Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, but that's not because I don't think highly of it. It's a very good, indeed, an absorbing account of the disaster of 1996 on Everest. So I would, definitely recommend that to anybody who hasn't read that yet. And they did halt all climbing during the pandemic. So in 2020, there weren't any climbings of Everest. It was officially halted by the Nepali government, but climbing has resumed. There were climbers in 2021. The climbing season is going to start, I think in about 6 weeks, and there will be climbers in 2022. Some people think there might be a record number of climbers, as a matter of fact, in 2022, based upon the climbing permits that have already been granted. So the tourist experience on Everest is with us once again. As far as the corpses on Everest are concerned, there are a great many corpses on Everest. We don't know the locations of all of them, but the estimate is that there are over 200 bodies on Everest that have never been taken down and never buried further down past the slopes. And the reason is it's very difficult to move bodies without damaging them under those conditions and carry down the bodies to the lowland areas. And for that reason, they're usually kept where they were and are. Mallory's is probably the most famous body. Only a few have actually seen that. The body that almost everybody who's climbed Everest for a long time was able to see was the body famously called Green Boots, because you could see the green boots protruding outside the snow. And that's the body of an Indian climber, never completely accurately identified, I don't think, but they think they know who it is. And I think only recently they've been able to remove that. I'm not sure, but that for a long time was the most famous body on Everest. But yeah, there's about 200 of them that we know of. And as far as the trash that accumulates on Everest, it used to be the case that there wasn't really much of an organized effort to remove that trash. It accumulated, and then they get people together and they do something about it. But it was on a haphazard basis until relatively recently. And now the Nepali army seems to be responsible at least once a year for giving the area a good major cleaning, at least removing most of the trash. There's an awful lot of it. They can't get all of it. It does accumulate, but there at least is a systematic effort now to make sure it doesn't get much worse, courtesy of the Nepali government and the Nepali army. And as far as wildlife in the upper reaches of Everest is concerned, I don't think there's anything much up there. But if you're in the region around 20,000 feet, maybe slightly higher than 20,000 feet, there have been reports of wolves now and then, bears now and then, and they think that the idea of the Yeti, which is a prominent part of the folklore of the peoples who live in the region, might be accounted for by bears, who may have been more prevalent than they are today up in those reaches. Bear tracks have been found, and in the popular imagination, sometimes they're considered Yeti tracks, but we think probably it's a kind of bear that probably were there in the old days in greater numbers than they are today. But there are some wildlife there, just not anywhere near the upper reaches of the slopes, where the oxygen, remember, is only 1/3 of what we know down here. I did also want to point out that Everest was first climbed, as I hope I pointed out, May 29th, 1953. But Kanchenjunga, which I also showed, the mountain that they thought was the highest mountain in the world, that was climbed a little bit later. That was climbed finally in 1955. Also, a very difficult peak at over 28,000 feet. Now, question number 9 here, given that humans lust for glory in some form during the brief lifetime, is there an alternative quest for physical glory that we should embrace instead of climbing Everest? Well, there are choices that include Everest that are even more demanding. One thing I didn't mention is that Hillary was the first person to climb or to attain what some people call the 3 poles. He was at the South Pole, he was at the North Pole, and he was at Everest. And that's a goal that others have achieved since. And that certainly is maybe the kind of thing that could lead you to say of yourself, I've probably done as much as anybody can do as far as surmounting physical human achievements. But as far as physical goals that are in the category of Everest, I'm not sure. I think probably any kind of a physical goal you set for yourself that makes you test yourself, maybe go a little bit further than you were prepared to go, and makes you feel a bit better about yourself for that, as long as it doesn't cause you physical harm, is probably a pretty good goal, especially if you're trying to raise money for a charity. And that's what Hillary did. Hillary devoted much of his life after Everest to whatever he could do to raise money for the people living around the valley where Mount Everest is, especially the Sherpa people. He and his foundation built hospitals there, and they built schools. And he always felt, I think, guilty for maybe disrupting the environment around Everest by opening the door towards the tourism that's become true about the place today. But I think anything that tests you in a way that's good for you, and maybe that helps you give something back to the world in the process, is probably a good thing. I'm not sure as far as major physical goals that are in the same category of Everest that are left to us, but I do know that there are very high peaks that have never been climbed. And a lot of those peaks that are over 20,000 feet, never climbed by anyone, are in the Kingdom of Bhutan. And the reason you can't climb them is that they have religious significance, according to the Bhutanese. And also, if anything goes wrong on those peaks, they have limited ability to go rescue you. At least there are helicopters in the Nepali army that could help people if they were in dire straits near Everest. The Bhutanese don't have as much of that. And so they restrict climbing there. And many climbers would love to get on those peaks, but right now they're just prohibited from doing so. Now, what percentage of climbers actually summit? I'm not sure about that, but that's probably something I should have looked up before the presentation. I know most of them seem to summit, and I know the danger and I know the fatalities often come on the way down. So they'll summit, and then they'll run into trouble on the way down, which some people take more for granted than they should, but it is actually in some respects more dangerous than actually going up. And groups do sometimes have to turn back, especially because the weather turns all of a sudden. I'm not sure what the percentage is, but I know that's not uncommon to have to turn back. And how did I get interested in the topic? Well, I spent my junior year abroad at a place in Kathmandu. So I was there when I was 19, and I was learning Nepali, and I was interviewing people who've been in the government of Nepal and who've been involved in that 1950 revolution that I talked about. And maybe there was something about that experience that left me with a lingering interest in Everest. I never saw it when I was a student. I didn't have any money to go anywhere near Everest, but I probably have been thinking about it in the back of my mind for a long time. So when one day university presented this as a possible topic, I said, why not? I'll take a stab at it. And I'm glad I did. Now, what effect has climate change had on mountaineering? Well, it could have a pretty dangerous effect, because what it might mean is more likely melting ice and melting snow, maybe earlier in the year. And what that would mean is maybe more avalanches and maybe more fatalities. And some people think that climbing on Everest should be more restricted than it is, precisely for that reason. So I think the outlook is probably dim. I think climate change means it's going to be warmer. More people might want to try to climb Everest, but it might be more dangerous once they get up there. I did want to also mention, just in the last minute, that Everest is the tallest mountain in the world from sea level. The second tallest mountain in the world is K2. And some might wonder, why is it called K2? Why not give it a name like almost all the other mountains based upon native tradition, or maybe a name after a famous person like Mount Everest is. And the reason is K2 was identified during the Trigonometric survey, and they just had to give it a temporary name. And it was K2, Karakoram Range 2. That's the second peak they found up there. And it stayed K2 because it turned out there was no native name for that peak. It had often been concealed from people living anywhere near there. And since there was no native name, they decided to keep it K2. And K2 remains what it is today. Although in local dialects, sometimes it's called Ketchu or Kitchu now, their own way of thinking about K2. Are the climbing permit fees the primary source of income for Nepal? Not the primary source. It's a major part of their income, not the primary source. They have some exports that they sell. They have foreign remittances from many Nepalis who live and work abroad and send their money home. And I would say that tourism in general is the primary source of income, but the climbing fees themselves wouldn't be the primary source of income. And I think that puts us right at 5 o'clock. And that means it appears our time together is done. Thank you very much for attending the presentation today. And I hope you all have a good rest of the evening. Thanks very much.